If you want to build more muscle, you probably subscribe to one of two schools of thought. You have Group A, who are the guys that say, just train hard and eat big. And then you have Group B, the guys who overanalyze every single detail of training. They overanalyze so much, they've actually become experts in every single area of training. Yet, they still haven't bench pressed that magical 225-pound bench, that 2-plate lift that all the guys in the high school gym are chasing. Now, I'm not going to sit here and hate on either of these groups, but I am going to tell you, if you want to build serious amounts of muscle, don't be like either of these groups. You'll either be left frustrated with little to no results for all the effort you're putting in, or you'll find yourself on the internet for 16 hours a day to the point that you forget to even make it to the gym or eat more food. But if you actually want to build more muscle, these are my top 10 tips to build more mass, specifically when we're talking about training. In no particular order. Number 1, your training split is not your training program. Your training split is a way to organize your training program. I can't tell you how many times per day I get messages like, Pete, what is the best training split for arms? What is the best training split for back? What is the best training split for general mass? Asking a general question like this, it's almost like asking what is the best outfit to wear to the gym. On a hot day, a tank top might make most sense. On a winter day, you probably want a hoodie. Similarly, when it comes to a training split, if your goal is to bring up your arms, or let's say you're doing a lot of volume for your arms, you're probably going to want a day dedicated to training that muscle group. Now, if you're someone like me who has well-developed arms but wants more attention to the chest and the back, having a day dedicated to arm training is just taking away from your recovery ability and time that you could spend training the chest and the back. Now, where most people get confused and where they go wrong with their training is, they first determine the training split, and then they fill out the rest of the program. That's a recipe for failure. To program your training effectively, you first need to determine what work you'll actually be doing. The sets, the reps, the exercises, and the intensity. Once you determine the total workload that you're doing, that will then help you determine what is the right split for your goals. Number 3, frequency is determined after volume and intensity, not before. This ties right into my last thoughts on the training split. Another question I get asked often is, how many times should I train a body part? The problem with this question is, people are automatically assuming that frequency is what determines results. But the truth is, how many sets you perform, how hard you perform those sets, those are things that actually determines how often you should train that muscle group. Let's say that you have a body part that develops easily, and you only need, let's say, 6 sets weekly for that muscle group to grow. That would call for 2 sets per workout done 3 times per week. Instead, you could cram all 6 of those sets into one session and your quality of work will still be high. That'll leave you with all the other sessions for the week to dedicate to other body parts. But now, let's say that you have a very stubborn body part. Or let's say you take a muscle group like back that has a ton of different areas that you want to develop. You want to focus on the lats, the middle back, the rhomboids, the lower back, even the traps. Let's say you combine all those sets together for back and that totals up to 15 to 20 total sets. Now, I usually never recommend cramming as many as 20 sets into one single training session. And once you get over roughly 10 sets per body part in one session, the remaining sets that you do after, they tend to suffer. You'll start to go through the motions, but instead, let's say you now cut that workout to just 10 sets on Monday. And then you come back in on either Thursday or Friday and you perform the remaining 10 sets of that workout. Now, the work that you do in the second workout, it's likely much more productive. And this is the perfect example of needing to train a muscle group twice per week. Now you're not training a body part just for the sake of it twice per week. You're training that body part twice per week to fit in all of the work that you need productively. It's not that twice per week training that made your back grow. It's the work that you're doing in the gym. And that split is allowing you to get the most out of that work. Tip number 3, progression. Progression, progression, progression. People argue all over the internet. What builds more muscle? Is it volume? Is it intensity? Is it frequency? I get asked all the time, Pete, high volume, low intensity, or low volume, high intensity? My answer is always progression. I don't care if you do 1 set to failure or if you do 10 sets of 10. The method that you use that takes you from a 135-pound bench press for 10 reps to a 225-pound bench press for 10 reps, all the way to a 315-pound bench press for 10 reps. That is going to be the method that allows you to grow the most muscle mass. And instead of overanalyzing how many sets you're doing, or the correct exercises, or the correct split, ask yourself, is this method allowing for progression? If it is, don't change anything. But if it's not, even if the training has the optimal number of sets, reps, and frequency, you're not making progress and your training is clearly not optimal. Tip number 4, talking a bit more about exercises specifically. Every body part should have at least 1 to 2 heavy loading movements as a focus of your training. When it comes down to progression, we're talking about progression on a movement. I'm not talking about powerlifting or your 1 rep max. I'm talking about as you become bigger, you become stronger. And as you build new lean muscle tissue, you'll be able to lift heavier weights and perform more repetitions. Don't get it confused. Powerlifters can build strength without ever putting on additional muscle mass. We've all seen that one guy in the gym who you'd never know lifts, yet has a 500-pound deadlift. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about training to build muscle. If you're training to stimulate muscle mass and you put on lean muscle tissue, that increase in muscle mass will allow you to lift heavier weight. And rather than using, let's say, the bench press or an incline press as an exercise that you're always trying to PR on, rather use that lift as a reference to putting on more muscle mass. Let's say you normally can bench press 225 pounds for 10 reps, but now, after 6 to 8 weeks of following a program, you can now do 12 to 15 reps with that same weight. That's a clear sign that you're developing or have developed new muscle tissue. And every effective muscle gain program should have one of these 2 movements for each body part as a staple. Tip number 5, full range of motion, but also understanding what full range of motion doesn't mean. Full range of motion will always win over partial reps. However, what most people don't understand is that there's full range of motion for a movement, and then there's full range of motion for you based on your own mobility. Full range of motion on a squat generally implies that you're squatting all the way down until your butt touches your ankles. But 90% of people in gyms don't have the mobility to do that. And you'll often see guys trying to have full range of motion on a squat. And with guys with poor mobility, what you'll generally see is them creating a greater range of motion, but they're actually squatting down lower just by rounding their lower back. If that's you, this actually does nothing to stimulate your quads more, and all it does is create a greater stress in the lower back. Similarly, let's say you're doing an RDL and your focus is on training the hamstrings, but you're trying to go all the way down to the floor. If you're going lower than the range of motion that allows you to keep a flat back, you're actually now taking the tension off the hamstrings and placing it on the lower back. You're not getting anything additional out of the target muscle by doing this, and you're actually just lowering the weight further than needed and creating additional risk for injury. So in general, when you're lifting, ask yourself, is this as far as I can stretch the target muscle? If yes, then that's full range of motion for you. Now, if you're lowering that bar further just to create a larger range of motion, keep in mind you might be incorporating other muscle groups or putting yourself at additional risk. If you can perform full range of motion on a movement, great, but always make sure you're training within your own personal range of motion based on mobility. Tip number 6, what gets trained first also gets prioritized. When setting up your training in the gym, everything should be placed strategically. Let's say you're running a push-pull leg split, and you also want to develop your delts. Understand that in this split, you're generally training those delts after you train your chest. And now, you're always going into your delt work pre-fatigued. And if you want to prioritize those delts, you might want to try, at the very least, making one of those push workouts front delt focused by training the delts first. You can hit all of your shoulder work first, then hit secondary exercises for the pecs after. Movements like flies, dips, and machine presses. The priority principle is one of the exact reasons that I'm not personally a huge fan of push-pull leg splits for guys who need to develop bigger arms. It's almost impossible to bring up a lagging muscle group if you're only training it at the end of the session, especially after you've already trained 1 to 2 body parts first. For guys who need to focus on, let's say, the chest and the back, push-pull legs can actually be a great split because it allows you to prioritize both of those muscle groups first in each of the workouts. Tip number 7, a great exercise for a muscle group is not necessarily the one that feels good, but one that allows for long-term progression. Today, the biomechanics community has really taken over social media. Everyone wants to learn which exercise targets a specific area of a muscle group, what exercise biases a specific muscle over another. And all those things, they're great to know. But the problem that no one seems to understand is that even if an exercise targets a specific muscle group well, it doesn't always make it a great exercise to build mass. Even an exercise like a cable press around might target the pecs well, and the inner pecs specifically. For those of you who don't know what that exercise is, it's an exercise where you grab a single cable handle and you press across the body to hit the inner pecs. But the question is, how much weight or reps do you think you can add to that lift long term? These movements generally require a lot more stability as you become stronger, and ultimately on exercises like this, the limiting factor doesn't become the target muscle. Not to mention, let's just say you went to the gym and you only performed cable press arounds, no other exercises. How much muscle mass do you think you're going to add to the entire body? But what about if you just went in and you did the bench press? Let's say that you added 200 pounds to your max bench press over your entire career training and you did nothing else. How much more muscle do you think you've built to your chest, your shoulders, your triceps, and all the supporting muscles of the upper body? So while one might feel better in the target muscle, you have to look at the movement's long-term potential to determine if it's a good exercise to build mass. There's a reason guys barbell and dumbbell press throughout their entire career. There's a reason they squat, they deadlift, or use some other variation. These movements all allow for long-term progression. Tip number 8. In training, you're not trying to lift more weight, you're trying to place more tension on the target muscle. We're not powerlifting. Our 1 rep max does not matter when building muscle. However, we do want to lift more weight or perform more reps over time. Most people hear this and they think that means they have to add the next 5 pounds to the bar. Train at all costs to do this. This mentality, it generally leads to less than ideal range of motion, poor technique in training, and even other muscle groups assisting in the lift. As a result, this actually leaves you with less tension on the target muscle. Let's say you did pull downs with 200 pounds for 10 reps last week, but now you added 5 pounds to the stack this week, but you had to swing the weight to get the reps. You might have completed that set with 5 more pounds for the same reps, but you actually took tension off the target muscle. You used more weight, but got less out of the movement. To remedy this, your goal should be that every single set looks exactly the same in the gym, even when there's more weight on the bar. Every set and every rep should be standardized. This is the only way that you can be sure that that increased weight lifted is due to getting bigger and getting stronger. Tip number 9, do the boring stuff. A solid training plan is generally made up of very basic things done over and over again consistently. Most people would pay good money for some magical plan. One that has drop sets, supersets, an elaborate training split, or some fancy frequency. But the fact is, the plan that gets people great results are generally ones with very basic principles. They're generally just applied over long periods of time. The plan that allows you to go to the gym, recover well, train consistently, come back and do it again, that plan is going to build way more muscle when it's executed over a long period of time. Way more than the fancy one that you can execute for only a few weeks before you burn out. Tip number 10. The appropriate volume is the one that allows for long-term progression. Another question I get asked constantly, Pete, how many sets should I perform for a muscle group? Guys, there's no magical number for everyone. Rather, there's a bit of a range. It's not like if you perform 9 sets per week, your chest won't grow. But if you perform 10 sets, you're gonna get massive. And if you perform 11, you're overtraining. There's a range of sets for each body part, given everyone's individual recovery. And there's also a range of sets that you can perform for your entire body. The exercises you choose and how hard you perform each set impacts these numbers as well. So there is no blanket answer to this question. It's your job to experiment with a bit of different training volume and intensity and find that right range that works for you. Or go with an experienced coach who can dial in your training volume so that you're progressing and recovering well. If you found any of these tips valuable, start applying them to your training now. And remember, don't overlook the basic principles. And if you want the exact training programs that I personally recommend to build more muscle using proven old school bodybuilding methods, all my old school mass gain programs are down below. And as always, if you want to see more of the best original bodybuilding content just like this, make sure to hit subscribe.